a Maccabean princess that Herod forcibly married, then executed, and then executed her children by him because he was jealous that they might supplant him, executed her brother because he thought they were more popular than he was. So if you were named Mariam or Miriam in 30 BC, you probably were a Maccabean sympathizer. I wouldn't name myself like in the Afro-American community. A lot of people are named like Kennedy, usually named after presidents that they admired. Roosevelt, like Roosevelt Greer, Kennedy, so on. They took often names of American president. Wilson, somebody. Lincoln, somebody. Usually you don't take a leader's name for your children unless you admire that leader. So since all the early Christians have Maccabean names, you get the impression that most of them come from families sympathetic to the previous Maccabean situation. By Maccabean names, I mean Judas, Simon, Mary, Miriam, John. These are all Maccabean names of the Maccabean ruling dynasty in this in the period 160 to 60. These are all names that were being used in the Maccabean family. So if you're born in the 30s or even the 10s of the next century and you've got one of these names, I think the impression is that the family is not hostile, certainly, to the Maccabees. And you're not called Herod after all, or Antipater, or some name like that. So you're naming yourself after Maccabean heroes. So I think that's very underappreciated in terms of the situation that we're talking about. Now, so Josephus tells us that this Antipater turned this governorship into a dynasty with Roman sponsorship and agreement, and that all his heirs in perpetuity were to be Roman citizens forever after for the services they rendered to Rome. And I told you previously that I think, in my book, I think, and I'm way ahead of myself, that's where Paul got his Roman citizenship from, because I've already assumed that Paul is a member of this very large Herodian family. By the time we get into the first century, you say, how do you know? Well, I told you last time that he sends his regards in Romans to his cousin, the little Herod. That's a pretty strong, if that's accurate, indication that he has some relation with the Herods. Also, his community, as described in Acts, is composed of at least one member who was the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch, it says in Acts. This person who was the foster brother of Herod the Tetrarch. Herod the Tetrarch is the person who killed John the Baptist. And he's supposed to be his foster brother, and he's in Paul's community in Antioch as a founding member. So there are lots of indications, it's just proofs that are, what do you call proof that's not sure, but circumstantial. They're not just circumstantial evidence, but it builds up into a presumption as you go along with this. In any event, to go back to where we were, we don't have Herod as king yet. So Antipater, there's a lot of Jewish unrest. And in the midst of this, that's what we're talking about, Caesar and Octavian. We're getting the assassination of Caesar in 44, and then the struggle between Mark Antony and Octavian in the 30s, that ended, I think, in 31 with the Battle of Actium. But in the middle of this struggle, we get Herod, Antipater's son, very unpopular person who had been, under his father, governor of Galilee. Where do we get this information from? Josephus. So we have very detailed information from this period. And as governor of Galilee, he had executed what is called in Josephus, Josephus didn't limit this time, he's using sources on the basis of credibility of sources, killed or executed bandits. You have to be careful of the word bandits, because it's a little bit like in Josephus, the Chinese communists, talking about American bandits who have flown over Chinese airspace back in the days of the Cold War. So I mean, bandits is often a euphemism for freedom fighter. And apparently Herod had executed some Galilean freedom fighters or bandits. We know that they must have been more than just bandits, because one of their names was Hezekiah. And that is a Davidic king name. One of the last Davidic kings at the time of the Babylonian conquest was called Hezekiah. And it turns out that his descendants are making pretensions to be kings. His descendants are making, so this is not just a normal bandit. This is someone who's at the head of an insurgency of some kind, a guerrilla insurgency. And take my word that that's true. If you read them, you'll see that that is true. In any case, the so-called Sanhedrin, this is a new body that didn't exist before. It comes into existence around the time the Romans take over. It's a kind of representative body of so-called Jewish notables, 70 members, and 2 leadership positions, a priest and a Davidic chair, which is where the Septuagint 72 comes from, because all committees are considered to be 72. Why 72? Where did the number 72 come from? Do you know? Well, because Moses was said to have taken 72 elders up on Mount Sinai with him when he got the law. And that's why Jesus sends out the 70, for instance, in the New Testament, because there were 70 members of the Sanhedrin. Also, there were considered to be 70 nations of the earth, 70 different language groups. So in fact, the 70 plays into both the leadership idea in Palestine and the language idea, like speaking in tongues, or the nations of the world that you get in the early pictures of the Book of Acts and places like that. There's a big conflict in the early part of Jesus' ministry. Is it 12 or is it 70? We got 12 apostles and 70 disciples. Theoretically, I'm not sure we have that really, but that's the presentation of the numbers. How do the disciples differ from the apostles? Well, half the time you're looking at it, the apostles are the disciples, and vice versa. So it's almost impossible to distinguish the two often.